I'm Tony Cheng, and this is Assignment Asia. Last week, in the first part of our special investigation into plastic pollution, we looked at the huge amount of microplastics that are already in the world's oceans, the impact that's having on sea life, including phytoplankton that contributes 50% of the globe's oxygen, and how it's getting into the food chain. This week, we're going to be looking a bit closer to home. Today, we're going to be looking at the plastic that's in the earth, where we grow our food, that's in the water that we drink, that's already in the air that we breathe. And with so much plastic all around us, what's it doing to our health, living in our plastic world?
Ya, syukuri apa adanya.
19-year-old Imam lives in a world surrounded by plastic pollution. In our previous program, he showed us the devastating impact the plastic waste has had on the fishing industry, where he works. But the plastic waste also surrounds his home and almost everything he does. As a hobby, Imam keeps chickens and goats in a small hut on the beachfront. He feeds them scraps and leftovers. But most of the time they're free to roam the beach, eating whatever they find.
Kadang makan plastik. Nyambeli kambing tuh, kadang isi daunnya masih utuh, kadang isi plastik, ada isi nasi.
Eating plastic that's in the fish he catches and the livestock he raises is a concern for Imam, but there's not much he can do about it.
Kalau ada takutnya, takut sedikit, cuman kan dah kami biasa dari 7 keturunan.
And the pollution has affected him in other ways too. The locals often start fires to burn up the rubbish, a vain attempt to reduce this very visible problem. But the heavy smoke, thick with burning chemicals, has had a profound impact on many of the residents. Imam now suffers from serious asthma, and he's afraid there may be other health problems he doesn't yet know about.
Sebenarnya sih ada rasa takut, cuman dari efek samping sampah ini masih belum terjangkit ke masyarakat, kecuali saat sampahnya dibakar baru ada beberapa masyarakat yang kena asma.
None of that's a surprise to Dr. Firdaus. He's the senior doctor at the local hospital, and he's noticed some distinct changes in his patients since the pollution arrived.
Ya, gini, kalau saya lihat isu kesehatan dengan adanya sampah yang berserakan, memang muncul. Yang terbanyak penyakit di sini itu diare, infeksi diare, gastrointestinal, infeksi lambung.
Have you seen any rise in long-term problems like cancer?
Kanker usus besar, kolon namanya itu ada juga. Cuma tidak banyak. Ada 2 orang kelihatan. Nah, problem penyebab simptomatik tidak diketahui apa, seperti itu. Soalnya kan selama ini kan ada penyakit, infection, ada penelitian. Nah, selama ini penelitiannya kan penyebabnya belum ada di sini.
Dr. Firdaus is busy enough trying to stem the tide of everyday illnesses hitting his patients. But his medical training has taught him there are bigger issues that need to be investigated.
Penyebab dari plastik, microplastic yang ada di dalam tubuh. Gejalanya itu apa? Nah, itu kan harus butuh penelitian. Cuma masyarakat sini itu banyak yang sakit diare sama mah istilahnya itu ya.
He started an outreach program trying to get to the source of the problem and warn the community of the dangers they face.
Ya, inilah sampah yang ada di Puncar ini, sangat banyak sekali, terutama sampah plastik ya. Nih banyak sekali sampah plastik. Ini airnya sudah tidak ngendap, bisa kena penyakit gatal-gatal, alergi karena air, bisa diare, uapnya itu bisa batuk, sesek, namanya bronkitis itu Bapak. Nah, inilah.
The goats feasting on the plastic buffet are a real concern.
Ya kalau sampah-sampahnya bersih, namanya sampah takut ada bahan racun yang kemakan oleh kambing. Masuk ke tubuh manusia, menyebabkan keracunan.
And even the stomach complaints, which can be treated relatively easily, can be deadly in poor villages like this.
Bisa diare, muntah, mual seperti itu, panas tinggi, shock, bisa menyebabkan kematian. Seperti itu, akibat kekurangan cairan.
Dr. Firdaus meets some fishermen down by the beach. Do you have any diarrhea or itchiness, he asks.
Kan airnya air sumur kan?
Yes, say the men, and show him the lesions on their legs and arms. He asks where they get their water from. The well, they say. But they also use the water on the beach. It's an ocean of opportunity for bacteria to breed. Lots of filthy water caught in millions of tiny plastic pockets, festering in the humid heat and breaking down all the time into smaller and smaller fragments.
That's insane.
For a specialist in environmental health, this is the doomsday scenario.
You've got probably quite high temperatures there, so you've got UV degradation, you've got mechanical degradation. So I just shudder to think what effect that would be having on humans' health.
Dr. Mahon works on the other side of the world in Galway, on the western coast of Ireland. But she's not surprised by the illnesses being diagnosed by Dr. Firdaus.
Yes, I would imagine a lot of inflammatory response. And inflammation leads to one thing and another. You know, it's always the start of something.
In that kind of environment. And like Dr. Firdaus, she's acutely aware that there's very little research available.
To date, there's very little known about the impact of microplastic pollution on human health. And it's an area where there's a huge knowledge gap.
The few studies that have been done on cattle suggest that once inside the body, microplastics can move around relatively freely.
One study from 1975 shows that when they fed the animals some PVC particles, that they were distributed then throughout the body.
But Dr. Mahon's research wasn't on the plastic-infested beaches. She's been looking at freshwater sources in remote areas of Western Ireland, idyllic areas far from human habitation, seemingly untouched by man. But even in these far-flung places, the spectre of plastic pollution looms large.
We've taken samples at reference sites where we would expect it to be quite pristine, coming down from the mountains, past urban centres. And the interesting thing is they're not really that different.
She's even found microplastics in insects, tiny fibres sucked up from fresh water. And while there are no proven links between damage to human health and ingesting plastic, there's plenty of cause for concern.
The biggest concern for me would be the association of the microplastics with chemicals. So there's a few different categories. One would be the building blocks of plastics themselves are monomers. And some of these, such as phthalates, which are in a lot of different plastics, are known to be endocrine disruptors.
Endocrine disruptors are chemicals that impact human hormones. They can cause cancers, birth defects, and other disorders. Additives such as fire retardants or colorings in the plastic can also have very serious side effects if ingested.
They say that 1 in 2 people are going to have cancer by, 2021. There are some, they're broad statements. But I think definitely in this country, cancer is on the increase, and people are definitely becoming more mindful about their environment as they wonder, why is this happening?
So you think microplastics could be a major contributor?
I wouldn't say that I think it would be a major contributor. I think plastics in general are a contributor, for sure.
Dr. Mahon had raised the spectre of airborne plastic pollution. Plastic particles carried on the wind to some of the most remote corners of the world. These are the cliffs that mark the end of Ireland and the beginning of the Atlantic Ocean, all the way across to the continent of America. But plastic pollution knows no boundaries. It's in the air, it's in the sea already, and it's moving freely all over the world. But surely there aren't significant amounts of airborne plastic. We would notice, wouldn't we?
The average Londoner is actually inhaling 1 billion or so particles of microplastic every year.
At King's College in London, they've been trying to measure the amount of plastic we breathe in from the air around us. Samples taken from various locations around the city are collected. The matter in the air is suspended in liquid and placed on a slide for examination.
So this is what your air sample looks like under a microscope. So this is a week's worth of air, and this is 10% of the particulates that have been sampled.
Looking at the particles under polarized light, the molecular structure is visible, showing what's plastic and what isn't.
So for this example, this is polystyrene.
After 3 years, the findings of the research are undeniable.
So what I've found is that plastics are in fact in the air, and they're prevalent in all the samples that I've looked at thus far. They go right down into the inhalable size range, so that's below 2.5 microns in size or in diameter, and they can be inhaled into our lungs.
I mean, when you step back and you look at the work that you've done over the past 3 years and you look at how much plastic is in the air that we're all breathing every day, does that surprise you?
Yes, definitely. I've been doing some indoor sampling, looking at the presence of plastics within our indoor environments, and I've been able to identify particles that are potentially within that respirable size range as well. And I suppose that was the most shocking identification that I've actually come through doing my PhD, or come to find in my PhD.
Overseeing this research is Professor Frank Kelly.
We now know from the studies that have been published in Paris and in China, and soon to be from London, that there are a whole range of different types of microplastic floating in our air.
But they're just uncovering the tip of the iceberg. Research into land-based plastic pollution is not as advanced as it is in the marine environment, and the early indications are disturbing.
If the sea animals are being affected by these new items which we didn't realize were there before, does that mean that we will be as well? And that's the logical chain of questions. And we're at this point now where we are saying, is there a link between microplastics and our health? And we don't know. We really don't know.
1 billion pieces of plastic sucked into our lungs every year. Some small enough to travel further into our bodies. And we don't really know what it's doing to our health. After the break, we look at how plastics are getting into the food that we eat. And in the Austrian capital, Vienna, we meet a doctor who spent the last 3 years looking through human excrement to find out how much plastic it contains.
Stories of hope, triumph, innovation, and change. We uncover the truth and go great lengths to tell a story. Get to know ordinary people with extraordinary stories and see Asia from an Asian perspective. This is Assignment Asia. Expect the unexpected.
The German capital, Berlin, is surprisingly green and lush for a major international city. Because of the divisions during the Cold War, large central areas remain covered in thick forests, fed by clear running rivers and lakes. Germany has some of the highest rates of recycling and the lowest rates of single-use plastics. But even here, the microplastics are everywhere. Researchers are now finding that microplastics aren't just present in freshwater close to populated areas where they'd expect to find it, but in more natural sources far away from human settlements. And that's because it's being carried in the air, for example, or in rainwater. It seems that microplastics are present in our lives wherever we are. Professor Kelly in London had told us about the sources of airborne microplastics in the environment.
They range from tiny specks of plastic which come from everyday furniture, from fibers in carpets, from synthetic fibers in tires. The modern car tire is now 50% synthetic plastic. It's not rubber as we used to know it.
In this huge decommissioned railway yard, they're trying to find out just how to stop those tires leaching microplastics into the environment. The research equipment is hardly high-tech. A tricycle for getting around and a big brush.
With this system, it's very easy to take samples which give you an information about the pollution on the road. And this pollution on the road has a high potential to inflate into the gully while it's raining.
What they found, combined with other research, is quite astonishing. Modern car tires made of rubber and plastic compounds are shedding massive amounts of plastic into the environment.
Estimations which are calculated give a number of about 120,000 tons rubber per year which are lost.
That's the equivalent of 17 million tires in Germany alone, and in just 12 months. Enough to stretch from Berlin to Beijing. So the team decided to invent a device to try and stop the runoff of microplastics, simulating the impact of rainwater on the roads.
The first part is a sieve stock, which has different sieves, which go down to a minimum size of 10 or 6 micron. It depends on the rain event. And there we catch all the solids in the different fractions.
What they've come up with works like this. As the rain washes off the roads, the runoff flows into the drains. Sensors use Wi-Fi signals to send back information about what's been collected and when the drains need to be cleaned. But this is just a trial. At the moment, 100 tons of rubber and plastic particles are mostly washed off the roads and straight back into the environment. For decades, our only solution to plastic waste was to bury it. Huge landfill sites around the world filled up with hundreds of tons of plastics. In the West, as space ran out and people objected to the environmental impact, they came up with a solution: ship it overseas. Now much of it comes to Asia: China, Indonesia, the Philippines and Thailand. What can be salvaged is, but most is just buried. But what's it doing down there? Plastic doesn't decompose like organic materials. It just breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces. Researchers in Berlin made a surprising discovery. They'd set out to look at the impact of microplastics on soil, assuming that many of the negative impacts seen in the marine environment would be reflected in the soil. What they found was rather different.
What we observed is that the effects were sort of neutral to positive, in some cases very clearly positive. So this was initially a bit puzzling to us because we had initially conceptualized microplastic as more a toxicological issue, like most people, for example, that work in the aquatic environment.
Different shapes of plastic do different things, but some can actually make plants grow faster.
For plants, especially when you use fibers, the soil is just easier to penetrate for the roots. So it makes the soil environment just more favorable for root growth, and therefore in total also for plant growth. Not for all plants, not in all situations, but we've definitely observed a fair number of positive effects.
What's good for the plants, however, isn't good for other life forms in the soil.
Other people have observed adverse effects of plastic on earthworms. So there was increased earthworm death, and there was also inflammation of the earthworm gut.
And while certain types of microplastics might benefit the soil, when they break down even further into nanoplastics, the news isn't good.
These small particles can just penetrate biological membranes and cause damage. And we have looked at that. We have found some negative effects on plant growth.
Nanoplastics are even smaller particles, so small in fact that they can penetrate the cell walls of plants and humans. And with so much plastic now embedded in our natural environment, there's no way to get it out.
I don't think we can retrieve them. I mean, when they're in soil, they're really built into the matrix of the soil. The stuff is gone. It's built into what soil is. And so I think it'll be very difficult to devise biotechnological means to get rid of this material in the end. So I think it's going to be here to stay if it really doesn't degrade any further.
So plastic particles are now present in the soil in which we grow our crops. It's in the air that we breathe and in the water that we drink. No surprise that it's getting into us. Perhaps it's not too surprising that we're finding microplastics in seafood like mussels and oysters that filter the seawater through their bodies. But what's increasingly of concern is that we're finding microplastics in food that we consume directly. Things like salt, or even sugar, or honey, and perhaps, most disturbingly, even in beer. The Austrian capital, Vienna, has a long history as a hub of medical knowledge. Dating back to the 13th century, some of the world's most celebrated physicians have pushed back the boundaries of medical science here. Now researchers at the Medical University of Vienna have turned their attention to human excrement and whether that contains plastic. Dr. Philipp Schwabel, a medical doctor, and Dr. Bettina Liebmann, an environmentalist, sent out a request to 8 different countries for stool samples. Participants had to record their diet and other lifestyle habits and send back their samples, which were filtered and tested. A dirty job, but someone had to do it.
And you have to consider that it's the task in this project was really a very special one, as we were the first ones investigating human stool. So from a scientific viewpoint, it was really very exciting to deal with those samples.
The results were emphatic.
In all samples which we took, 8 out of 8, they were positively tested for the presence of microplastic.
Every single sample contained plastic. They defined their search to 10 of the most common plastics. 9 were present in the samples. Are these microplastics that are being given off from like the PET bottles we drink from, or is it coming from the food chain, from animals that we're eating that have ingested plastics, or are we breathing it in? Is there any way to tell?
So there are so many potential sources of plastic, since we are surrounded in our daily life by this very often very beneficial material, that it's really hard to tell.
Dr. Schwabel had handled the medical side of the research. He's a gastroenterologist, a specialist in the human stomach. So I asked him, if we're all eating plastic, what's it doing to us?
I cannot really tell you at the current stage of knowledge. There is much more research needed in this area. We have certain papers which report impact on sea animals, on fish, but this is not only the microplastic itself, it could also be that the chemicals which leach out of these plastic particles, they cause harm and disrupt, for instance, the endocrine system. If the same is true for humans, this needs to be determined by future trials.
Dr. Schwabel notes that both cancer rates and inflammatory bowel diseases are on the rise. But he's at pains to stress that the research just hasn't been done into whether plastic is a factor.
Why has the medical community not thought about the possible medical effects of living in a plastic world?
The interest is surely growing, and more scientists, also from the medical field, dig into this topic. However, it is difficult to perform research on it, because to determine a threshold concentration, which is necessary to show detrimental effects on human health, is a question of toxicological research.
It's all very complicated, but basically there are so many types of plastics, additives and other possible pollutants that each one would have to be tested on humans to test just how poisonous they are. On the environmental side, however, there's much to be done. It's a message we'd heard from almost everyone we spoke to.
There is already a beginning of a development in the right direction, and by that I mean a more conscious use of plastic materials, but also other materials. So we have to work towards a circular economy, so that we treat the materials, the resources that we have, in a circular way, and not to use materials just one time and then dispose of them maybe inappropriately by just littering them on the beach.
It all paints a pretty grim picture, especially for the people we started this journey with back in Indonesia. Imam has seen his livelihood as a fisherman destroyed because of the pollution, and it's made him sick. The childhood home he remembers for its clean sands and crystal waters is now gone. And when he thinks about his future, it's hard to see it here.
Kalau diri saya sendiri sih, kalau punya anak, pengen hidup dengan keluarga saya di tempat yang bersih. Tapi saya tidak mau meninggalkan rumah saya tercinta yang di Pantai Munjang.
But in a world where plastic is everywhere, there's no escape. It's almost impossible to answer the question, what is all of this plastic doing to us? Like so many resources, we've used it with abandon before we learned how to handle it properly. And only now are doctors starting to ask questions about what happens when we eat it, when we inhale it, when it gets into our system. But it's too late. It's all around us. What we do know is that we have to start to use it less and far more responsibly. But there's no way we can get rid of it. And now we have to learn how to survive in our plastic-infested world. But that's all the time we have for this week. I'm Tony Cheng, and this is Assignment Asia.